There's an island in Central Asia that the Soviet Union spent 40 years making sure you'd never find. Thing is, now you can just rock up and drive there. Fancy a proper adventure? Rent yourself a four-wheel drive in Nukus, point it north, and in a couple of days you'll be standing slap bang in the middle of what used to be the most secret biological weapons site in the entire Soviet arsenal. No checkpoint, no signs, not even a sea anymore, but we'll come to that. Most people have never heard of Vozrozhdeniya. That was the whole point. For decades, the place sat in the middle of the Aral Sea, the fourth largest inland body of water on Earth. 200 square kilometres of dust and scrub orbited by Soviet patrol boats. Nobody got close, nobody got curious. The CIA knew the rough coordinates by the late 70s and couldn't get a single agent within 100 miles of the place. What the Soviet Union was doing on Vozrozhdeniya was, on paper, illegal under a treaty Moscow had signed in 1972 and never stopped breaking. They tested anthrax there, smallpox, plague, tularemia, things with names you have to look up, things they invented, weaponized, and let loose on cages of monkeys and tethered horses to see how the wind carried them. What I want to know is this: if a place is that dangerous, that classified, that buried, how does it end up on a tourist itinerary by 2026? The answer is the strangest bit about this whole story. The Soviet Union didn't abandon Vozrozhdeniya, the sea did. The Aral Sea has lost more than 90% of its volume since the 1960s, and what was once an island in the middle of nowhere is now just a flat patch of poisoned ground in the middle of the youngest desert on Earth. By mid-2001, it was a peninsula. By 2008, it was just land. By 2014, there was no shoreline left to mark where the island ended and the desert began. Which means the moat is gone, and the things buried under that moat aren't. If you're enjoying this kind of story, do follow me for more. I've got some really fascinating places I'm working on that you won't want to miss. Right now, scrap metal scavengers walk in without protective gear. Tour operators run jeep safaris within sight of the old laboratory complex. The Uzbek government has zoned part of the area as a national park. A gas exploration concession overlaps the same coordinates where Soviet scientists once dumped 200 tons of weaponized anthrax into pits and poured bleach on top. Stay with me, because the bleach didn't work, and the scientists pouring it definitely knew it wouldn't. We'll get to a panicked train leaving Sverdlovsk in the spring of 1988, and 24 boxcars of what shouldn't have existed at all. Before the Soviets touched it, Vozrozhdeniya was nothing much to speak of. Geographically, I mean. 200 square kilometres of dry scrub and salt flats, formed sometime around the late 1500s and early 1600s, when the Aral was high and uneven, and certain shallow areas exposed themselves into land. There were no inhabitants and no fishing villages, no shrines, no ruins. Russian explorers mapped the place in the mid-19th century. An 1848 expedition under naval officer Alexei Butakov, sailing the schooner Konstantin, named one of the islands in the chain Nicholas I Island, after the Tsar. The Ukrainian poet and painter Taras Shevchenko was on board as the expedition's artist. He sketched the coastline. Nobody sketched anything else. The island sat there, unwanted, for another 70 years. Then, in the 1920s, the Red Army went looking for somewhere to put a problem. The problem was simple enough. The Soviet leadership wanted a program to weaponize infectious disease, and they needed a place to test it. Their criteria were specific and not subtle. They wanted somewhere relatively large, somewhere 5 to 10 kilometers from any populated coast, remote enough that an accidental release would die in the wind before it reached anyone who could speak about it. They considered the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea and Gorodomlya on Lake Seliger. Lake Baikal was discussed and rejected as too close to ordinary Soviet life. Vozrozhdeniya, the renamed Nicholas I Island, sitting in the middle of an inland sea between what would later become Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, fit every requirement on the list. The first expedition went out in 1936. Ivan Mikhailovich Velikanov led around 100 personnel from his biotechnical institute onto the island and ran a season of experiments. The following July, before the second expedition could be organised, Velikhanov was arrested by Soviet security organs and shot, which, rather sets the tone. That isn't a typo, and it isn't a digression, it's the entire mood of the place. The first man who knew what was being built on Vozrozhdeniya didn't survive the year. The replacement, Leonid Katanover, picked up the work in late 1937 with a focus on tularemia dissemination. 2 ships and 2 aircraft were assigned to him. The full bioweapons laboratory, formal and codified, was established in 1948. In 1954, the site was expanded and given the official designation Aralsk 7. From the outside, it looked like a closed military town. From the inside, it was a research city. There were apartment blocks, a school, a swimming pool, a clinic. Children of scientists growing up watching their parents leave for shifts at a complex 3 kilometres from the housing area, with no idea what their parents actually did. At its peak, the population approached 1,500 people. They had a name for the town, Kantubek, that you couldn't find on any Soviet map. The agents tested at Aralsk 7 are worth listing once, because the list isn't abstract. Anthrax, smallpox, plague, brucellosis, tularemia, Q fever, botulinum toxin, Venezuelan equine encephalitis. The strain of anthrax produced for weapons use was called anthrax 836, and it had been isolated from rodents captured after a separate Soviet anthrax leak in the city of Kirov in 1953. They were testing it on tethered animals on a range called Barkhan, in open air, watching what the wind did with it. In April 1972, the Soviet Union signed the Biological Weapons Convention in London, Moscow and Washington. The treaty banned the development, production and stockpiling of biological weapons. The signature on that treaty was, on the day it was inked, a lie. The work at Aralsk 7 didn't pause. The wider Soviet bioweapons program, called Biopreparat, went into a higher gear, eventually employing tens of thousands of scientists and technicians across more than 50 facilities. By 1979, the strain produced at a sister facility in Sverdlovsk was the most powerful anthrax in the Soviet arsenal, designed for intercontinental ballistic missile warheads aimed at American cities. That spring, something went wrong in Sverdlovsk. On the last Friday of March 1979, a technician at Compound 19, on the southern edge of the city, did something almost mundane. He removed a clogged filter from the exhaust system of a drying machine that produced powdered anthrax spores. The drying machines were temporarily off. He left a note for the next shift, telling them the filter needed replacing. The note got lost, or filed, or ignored, or simply not read. The next shift turned the machines back on. What happened over the following hours is contested, because the records were destroyed by the KGB before any Western investigator got near them. The Soviet defector Ken Alibek, who later ran a parallel anthrax production facility at Stepnogorsk and defected to the United States in 1992, said the death toll was at least 105. The Harvard team, led by Matthew Meselson, who finally got access to Sverdlovsk in 1992 and reconstructed the outbreak from witness interviews and weather data, found at least 68 confirmed deaths in the city itself, plus animal anthrax cases in 6 villages downwind. The real number is somewhere in between and is likely closer to Alibek's figure than to the one the Soviets eventually admitted. For nearly a decade, The official story was contaminated meat. A black market butcher had supposedly sold anthrax-tainted beef in the suburbs south of the compound. This explanation didn't survive contact with the autopsies. The victims had inhalational anthrax, not gastric anthrax. Inhalational anthrax doesn't come from eating bad meat. It comes from breathing in spores. The plume, when Meselson finally mapped it, ran in a narrow corridor from Compound 19 south past a ceramics factory, picking off victims along the prevailing wind line. The ceramics factory employed 2,180 people, and its ventilation system pulled outside air directly into the workshop floor. Most of the dead worked there. That was 1979. The Soviet response was to lie, vaccinate 80% of 59,000 local residents against anthrax, and continue the programme. What changed in 1988 was politics. Reagan's administration was pushing hard for inspections under the Biological Weapons Convention. You know, that treaty everyone had signed saying they'd stopped making plague bombs. Gorbachev's government was trying to negotiate arms reductions, but they were genuinely worried that some inspection team might rock up at Compound 19, or worse, find their way out to Vozrozhdeniya. So what do you do when you've got 200 tons of weaponised anthrax sitting about and the Americans want to come have a look? Well, if you're the Soviets, you panic. Properly panic. 200 tons of weaponised anthrax 836. That was the inventory. 200 tons of dried and powdered spores sitting in tanks at Compound 19, waiting to be loaded into intercontinental missiles that everybody had supposedly stopped building in 1972. The scientists at Compound 19 had a few weeks to sort this out. They loaded the slurry into these stainless steel containers, TR-250s they called them, and added sodium hypochlorite. That's bleach, essentially, meant to neutralise the spores. Here's the bit that really gets you though. The bleach is where you catch them in the lie. See, anthrax scientists, proper ones, they know exactly what bleach does and doesn't do to anthrax. Wet spores, bleach will sort them right out. Dry spores, clumped together the way anthrax 836 was produced, different story entirely. The bleach kills what's on the outside. What's tucked away in the centre stays very much alive. The scientists pouring it definitely knew this, but in good old Soviet fashion, they did it anyway, because the order was to clean it up before the inspectors arrived, not to actually clean it up. The TR-250 containers went onto a military train of 24 boxcars. The train left Sverdlovsk and travelled roughly 1,000 miles south to the Kazakh railhead at Aralsk. From Aralsk, the cargo was airlifted, in stages, to Vozrozhdeniya. There it was unloaded into a series of pits dug into the earth in a zone designated PRSL 52 on the northern edge of the laboratory complex. The pits were small, roughly 2 metres wide, 5 metres long, 3 metres deep. There were 11 of them. The bleach went in, the dirt went on top. The whole operation, hundreds of tons of the most lethal biological agent ever produced by a state, was buried in pits the size of a large grave, on an island in a sea that was already beginning to die. This is the moment to use the word the Soviets gave to the place, Vozrozhdeniya. In Russian it means rebirth, Rebirth Island. That is what they called the testing ground. Rebirth Island is where they buried the thing they had spent 40 years building and then needed, suddenly, to make sure no one ever found. The bleach didn't work, and the scientists pouring it definitely knew it wouldn't. The next part of the story is what happened to those pits when the country that dug them stopped existing. December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. Aralsk 7 has, on paper, no government left to run it. The decision had been made in November of that year at a Ministry of Defence meeting in Zagorsk. Terminate experimental work, evacuate personnel, walk away. By late April 1992, every military unit was off the island. The civilian population, the families, the children who had grown up in a town that did not appear on maps, were given a few weeks to pack what they could carry and were gone. What they left behind is the part that should make any reasonable person sit down for a minute. There were petri dishes still in incubators. There were animal cages, some still containing infected test subjects. There were freezers with cultures still active, and the freezers were running on power that was about to be switched off. There were unmarked graves of test animals, hundreds of them, with up to 100 carcasses dumped in a single pit. There was at least one human grave, a woman who had died handling an infectious agent in the 1970s, marked nowhere in the records that survived. There were the 11 anthrax pits at PRSL 52, full of bleach-saturated soil that was not as decontaminated as the documents claimed. There were the open-air test ranges, where the soil itself had been seeded with whatever the wind had carried during 4 decades of dispersal trials. And there was the laboratory complex, buildings the scientists had run out of, doors left open, equipment still on the benches. In some rooms, the cleaning was so rushed that biological samples were left where they sat. The Soviet government's plan, such as it was, had been to come back later and do a proper decommission. The Soviet government was no longer the government of anywhere by January. Ken Alibek, who had been deputy director of Biopreparat, defected to the United States in 1992. His debriefings to American intelligence are the reason any of this is publicly known. His memoir, Biohazard, published in 1999, is the document everything else cites. Without Alibek, the West would still be guessing what was on Vozrozhdeniya. In 2002, a joint US and Uzbek decontamination project went onto the island. It was funded by the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program at around $6 million American dollars. 100 local workers in protective suits in 50-degree heat dug a trench, lined it with plastic, and hauled contaminated soil into it from 10 of the burial sites at PRSL 52. They saturated the soil with bleach powder for 6 days. The project took 4 months. When it was done, the official position was that the burial sites were neutralised. The official position was based on what Ken Alibek had told them and what they could find with shovels. Les Bailey is an anthrax expert at Cardiff University. When he was asked, on the record, whether anthrax could still be present on Vozrozhdeniya after the cleanup, his answer was a sentence I have not been able to stop thinking about. "Oh, there will still be anthrax there, no problem." He was not making a horror movie statement. He was making a microbiologist statement. Anthrax spores can survive in soil for centuries. The cleanup addressed the buried inventory from 1988. It did not address 40 years of open-air dispersal across an entire island. It did not address the burial pits of test animals, or whatever was leaking from containers that had been abandoned, not buried, when the place was evacuated. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that doesn't get told. The cleanup was not a failure. It was a partial success at addressing one specific problem. The problem of an entire island being a contaminated testing ground was never on the table. It was not in the budget. It was not in the diplomatic agreement. The American team and the Uzbek team did what they were asked to do, and what they were asked to do was a small fraction of what would have been required to actually decontaminate Vozrozhdeniya. There is also the strain question. In Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan, there is an antibiotics-resistant variety of plague that has been cycling through rodent populations for decades. Bioweapons researchers, including Alibek, have warned on the record that the strains tested at Aralsk 7 included engineered varieties of plague designed to evade existing antibiotics. Whether the post-Soviet plague in Central Asia is connected to what was tested on Vozrozhdeniya is not provable. It is also not unprovable. The rats and ground squirrels that were the test subjects, and the rats and ground squirrels that survived the poisoning of the test ranges, did not stop existing in 1991. They burrowed, they migrated, they bred. Rebirth again. The word the Soviets gave the place is the word that describes what the place may have been doing, quietly, for 30 years. The next layer is what is happening on top of all this, right now, in 2026. Here is the situation today. The Aral Sea is gone. Not metaphorically, geographically. The southern basin, which is the side that contained Vozrozhdeniya, has lost more than 90% of its volume since the 1960s. By 2014, satellite imagery showed it had effectively dried out. What replaced it is called the Aral Kum, the youngest desert on Earth. Around 55,000 square kilometres of salt-crusted dust and scrub that 20 years ago was lakebed. The wind that comes off the Aral Kum carries that dust. I went looking for research on where this dust ends up and found something rather unsettling. Researchers have found particles from the former Aral Sea floor in agricultural fields in Belarus, in Norwegian forests, and on the surface of glaciers in Greenland. The dust contains pesticides from decades of cotton cultivation runoff that drained into the sea before it died. Researchers studying the dust have raised concerns that biological residue from open-air testing on Vozrozhdeniya may also be carried. Vozrozhdeniya itself is no longer an island. By mid-2001, it was a peninsula. By 2008, when the southeastern arm of the South Aral disappeared completely, it was simply land. By 2014, you could not have identified where the old shoreline was without a map. The territory is now split between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, with the precise border still subject to administrative dispute. Islam Karimov, the long-term president of Uzbekistan, died in September 2016. Karimov had run the country as a closed authoritarian state since independence, and the areas around the former Aral Sea were heavily restricted. After his death, his successor began opening previously sealed regions to outside visitors. Tour operators in Nukus, the regional capital of Karakalpakstan, started running jeep safaris into the Aral Kum. Some of those safaris go as far as the ruins of Kantubek, the ghost town where the Aralsk 7 scientists had lived. By 2020, Kantubek itself had been demolished by the Uzbek authorities. There is today almost nothing left of the town. Cracked tile, pieces of brick in the sand, foundations. The cruciform outline of the old Barkhan airstrip, visible from satellite, slowly being eaten by the desert. Yusup Kamalov is a scientist who has lived in Karakalpakstan for decades. He is the president of the Union for the Defense of the Aral Sea and Amudarya, which is one of the few independent environmental organizations in the country. When asked about whether Vozrozhdeniya would become a tourist destination, his answer was not a no. He said it could be. He has been saying it could be for years. The tourists are already there. The official designation has not caught up with the reality on the ground. Here is the part that really got me when I was reading. In recent years, the Uzbek government has formally established the Aral Kum National Nature Park. The protected area covers a vast stretch of the former seabed. The highest point in the park is a feature now officially named Peak Vozrozhdeniya, sitting at the centre of what used to be the island. The brochure language describes a recreational zone, an ecotourism destination, artesian water from 700 meters below the surface available as a draw for visitors. The same documentation acknowledges that the protected area overlaps with a major gas exploration concession granted by the Uzbek government to international energy companies. The park authority's own published material says, with no apparent irony, that work is ongoing to determine which areas are suitable for industrial intervention, which areas can be used for tourism, and where humans should not set foot at all. The third category: where humans should not set foot at all. That category exists. It is on the paperwork. The paperwork does not say where exactly those zones are. It does not have to. Anyone with a four-wheel drive can find them. I went looking for the latest reporting on scrap metal scavenging in the Aral Sea, and what I found is bleaker than the older accounts suggest. The economic incentive to walk into the area has not gone away. Copper wiring and scrap steel, anything from the abandoned military infrastructure across the former seabed, gets pulled out by men with backpacks and resold in markets in Nukus and across the Uzbek border. They are not wearing protective gear. They are not being warned. The 2002 American cleanup report has not been published in Uzbek. The locations of the 11 burial pits are not marked. There are no signs. There is also the question of what the Russian Federation has actually said about any of this, which is essentially nothing. Russia has never publicly confirmed the full inventory of what was tested at Aralsk 7, not what was buried at PRSL 52, not what genetic modifications were made to which strains, not whether any of the strain libraries developed there were transferred to other Russian facilities before the 1992 evacuation. The 2002 cleanup operated on what Ken Alabek had told the Americans and what they could verify with their own samples. 10 burial sites were decontaminated. Whether there are others, and how many, is not something either the Uzbek or the Russian governments have ever publicly addressed. I will leave you with the smallest detail I found in the research, because in this story it is the small details that stay. Somewhere on what used to be Vozrozhdeniya Island there is an unmarked grave. A woman is buried there. She died in the 1970s, handling an infectious agent at Aralsk 7, and her body was buried on the testing ground, because that is what they did with bodies they could not return to the mainland. There is no marker, there is no name on a stone, there is no record of where, precisely, on the island the grave is located. A man with a backpack of copper wire walks past her every other week, and he does not know she is there. At the start of this video, I told you that most people have never heard of Vozrozhdeniya. That was the entire point. The Soviet Union spent 40 years making sure of it. They built a city on it that did not exist on any map. They denied a treaty they had signed. They stocked the place with a list of pathogens that reads like a denial of service attack on the human body. They tested those pathogens, openly, on a range called Barkhan until 1991. When the country fell apart, they evacuated in weeks and abandoned what they could not carry. And the world found out the broad shape of the story only because one man, Ken Alabek, walked into an American embassy and told it. That was 1992, 34 years ago. In those 34 years, the sea around the island has retreated more than 100 kilometers. The moat that kept Vozrozhdeniya secret is dust. The town has been bulldozed. The name has been quietly attached to a national park and a hiking peak. The strain libraries are buried under bleach that did not work. The graves of test animals are unmarked. The grave of the woman is unmarked. The pits at PRSL 52 are unmarked. The country that knows where everything is buried is not the country that owns the land anymore. And the country that owns the land never had the records to begin with. It is no longer the case that nobody can get to Vozrozhdeniya. It is only the case that nobody is looking. The sea is gone. The island is gone, in the geographic sense. Gone in the way it is no longer surrounded by anything. But the substrate remains. Whatever the Soviet Union spent 40 years putting into the soil is still in the soil. The wind picks it up. The rats carry it. The scavengers walk through it without knowing. Vozrozhdeniya, rebirth. The Soviet name for the place was always wrong about the wrong things. The island is not being reborn. What is buried under it might be. Let me know in the comments what place you'd like me to dig into next. There are some really fascinating stories out there that most people have never heard of, and I'd love to know what catches your eye.